Hey, Scott.
That might be 20 years from now.
Hey, Scott.
Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Morning, Scott.
Well, how's the recovery coming?
Good. I'll do some outpatient PT start next week. And
Yes.
So do you have 6-8 weeks before you're back on the golf course, or a little bit longer than that?
Labor Day is my goal.
Go, good. Always good to have goals.
All right, let's get started with a prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let's pray. Holy and loving God, we give you thanks for this day. Thank you for this community. Pray as we study scripture together, even those parts that are sometimes challenging, that your spirit would guide us, inspire us, help us to ask questions, and help us to do those things that we learn from our study. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So who has read ahead to chapter 13 and following? Anyone ahead of us on 2 Kings?
Are you kidding?
Someone here said, "Are you kidding?" So I'll take that as a no.
We're like middle school students.
Yeah, middle school students. Well, I know in middle school, if you would, say there's something kind of off color coming up, then people would look ahead and read, right? Yeah. So it's like the wife of Bath's tale. I remember our teacher tricking us to read that in high school. But yeah, if we want to know the whole story, as we've been saying all along, 2 Kings is part of the story. And again, as we've said, just to keep repeating, it's written from a point of view, and it's a Deuteronomistic point of view, whether that's one author or more likely a group of people, but that took the history, kind of the raw material of history, and said, here's what this means because of our faith in God, that those who are evil are punished, those who are good are blessed, those who are pretty good are pretty blessed. So we'll run into that some. Where they will talk some about the kings who did right in God's eyes, but didn't do everything right. They didn't do some of the reforms that will be coming up in near to come chapters, like from Hezekiah, where he did more reforms. So again, today, kind of like last week, I hope it's okay with everyone. We're going to move kind of fast to cover the material, but we'll stop, for your insights, your questions, because, a lot of it is kind of similar. So it's kings, war, doing the wrong thing, getting defeated. There's like this cycle that repeats. But again, it's leading toward a conclusion that is important for the whole story. And that's coming up in chapter 17. So probably after we finish this week, we'll be at the place where we'll be looking at chapter 17. And that is actually the fall of Samaria or Israel. So that's going to be a big change in the history of God's people and their exile from their land. So remember, it's 2 kingdoms, the northern and southern kingdom, and they're defeated and exiled in 2 different eras of the history. So any just fun opening comments before we look at the text? I don't see any hands.
Okay.
All right. Let's look at the text.
I have a comment.
Sure.
I look at this, we've been in the Bible since Genesis, but especially in the evolution of Judaism, I see things unfolding here.
Okay.
Trends.
Sure.
Themes, developments.
Sure.
And one of these themes that developed, especially in the Exodus period, is the law. And then we go on, and then kingdom and kingdoms appear.
Yeah.
And then we enter into another major development, this develops along with the kings and kingdoms, although it started a little before and persisted afterwards, the prophetic movement. And then we also see a very major thing that began with the kings, with Solomon, the temple cult. But also, as I look at these are very, very major developments.
Right.
And yet, most of them didn't persist. They die. Certainly, the kings and kingdom trend didn't last very long. About 300 years for the northern kingdom, for, I don't know, 400 and something for the southern kingdom. Kings and kingdom died. The prophetic movement, especially by the post-exilic period, kind of dies out. The temple cult, that one persisted until a little bit after Christ. That was for about 1,000 years. The point of all this is, in my theologic thinking, it would seem that these things aren't fixed. Is God always doing a new thing? And the second thing, kings and kingdoms and all these developments, are they evolutionary dead ends, or are they the building blocks that we build on to progress to where we are now? And the final thing is going back to God is doing is often doing a new thing, or always doing a new thing. Personal theology, sometimes think that what we have now is fixed, but this may well not be the case.
Right. Well, you're asking all the big questions. So those are, I think, fair. I can give you my point of view, but anyone have a point of view they'd like to build on what Hutch was saying? Okay, well, I think those are all right questions. One point of view is it is evolutionary. I mean, you can see that in nature. You can see that in our understanding of God, that it's a development. Cardinal Newman talked about a development of Christian faith, that it's not something that is just where it came down from Mount Sinai or wherever. So, okay, this is it. No more. It seems like, especially from the call of Abraham, those stories of faith and God, and then those descendants through a covenant, getting that relationship blessed and continued. And then the whole story of both, that is a repeated story of having folks go into slavery, what happened in Egypt, and then God saving them, and then that being a continuing pattern that then, especially in the stories we're hearing now, we're hearing it over and over. One thing I think I mentioned last week is that there is a sense of God taking what we as human beings ask for, and even if it wasn't God's first thought or best thought, God using it. So kings are a good example of that. If you read portions of Samuel, I guess 1 Samuel, there's that sense of, Samuel the prophet is upset because the people don't want to keep, this loose confederation with judges as their political leaders and God as their king. And instead they want a king, a human king, like all the people around them, the surrounding folks. And God said to Samuel, they haven't rejected you, Samuel, they rejected me. But go ahead and give them a king. And so then you see kind of all the mischief that comes out of having king. So what I think Samuel said on behalf of God is they're going to tax you, they're going to raise armies, they're going to draft you, they're going to do things where they accumulate wealth and power at your expense. Now, what happens then, again, from what Hutch is saying, the evolution, how God redeems that is in Jesus and a different type of king. And so a king who's a servant leader who gives his life as a ransom to bring people back to God, not a king who dominates and uses violence. So, that's just one example. So that I would say, yes, there's an evolution. It's God's response to some of our initiatives to make them turn back to what God desires, which is justice and mercy and that connection with us. Excuse me, I'm writing a text on this pastoral thing real quick. I apologize for being distracted. All right. Any other comments before we get into the text a little bit more?
I have a comment.
Sure. And talk loud.
Yeah, I like Hutch's beginning. I didn't hear it all, but at the end, something about, is this the way it always, going to be from now on? Which, of course, you addressed with the evolutionary thing. I think it's really arrogant of any stage in history to say we've got it.
Right. I hope not. Yeah.
So, and also God interacts with our choices. Now, our choices are of free will. So God, it appears to me, must certainly be in constant, how do I react to this? Because God's not ordering everything that happens. We are free to do stuff, both as a community and as individuals. So yeah, I'm 100% into the evolutionary process of faith and of spirituality and of community under God's leadership.
Okay. Yeah. So Louise kind of echoes, I think, what Hutch was pointing to, and I'm, saying is that if you, again, just look at nature, forget humans for a second, and how things evolve and the beauty of that, the diversity of that, the mystery, things that we don't get, whether it's out in far space or just here near to us, that there's something that God is a creator who does things that if you're a creator at all and in some artistic way, you can, I think, see that, how we're made in God's image. So one verse I particularly like out of Ephesians is that we are God's artwork or handiwork, and we're created in Christ for the things that God intends. So there's an aspect of, I think the end result is basically, we know where it's going to end, but in the in-between, there's a lot of creativity and how it evolves over time. And frankly, there's some bad choices, or, look at history like we've been doing in 2 Kings, or things like, well, this isn't good at all, but God is still involved in some way to make good out of our wrong choices, or even evil to be, in the extreme at times. So that's waxing philosophical. That's a good thing to do if Scripture helps us to ask those important questions. I do want to go ahead and get in the text, and then we can come back and forth as we need to. So we're going to get a lot of kings, a lot of things going on. Jehoahaz. So, they kind of compare these kings, and this person's king of reign during his reign in Judah. This person was the king in Israel and Samaria. So, that is going on. So Jehoahaz, if that's how you say that, becomes king, and he is a son, and this is in Israel. He is the son of Jehu. That person reigns for a period of time, was 17 years. He did what was evil. So again, what we said in prior weeks, Israel's kings are almost always evil. There might be some that are a little less evil, but they're usually evil because of the basic premise. They've rebelled from the Davidic throne. They've rebelled from Jerusalem and worshiping at the temple. So, those are fundamental. And then it's also worked out in some of the evil they do. So he continues those sins of Jeroboam, the king who rebelled against Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. And so there was anger from God, the way it's written. There's like this wrath of God that is a result of their sin. And so King Hazael, who we've heard of before, king of Aram, and then his son, Ben-Hadad, who, again, we've heard of both of them. They both have a lot of victories against Israel. So Jehoahaz prays, and God hears him. And so for that, in verse 5, this is kind of vague. It's an interesting thing. In verse 5 of chapter 13, the Lord gave Israel a savior. Doesn't say who, doesn't say what, but something happened so that the king of Aram is defeated, or they escape from his oppression, and that the people of Israel kind of live in peace. They have some autonomy again, away from these raids and war. But they still didn't, even though the king had prayed for God's intervention, they didn't stop, and especially what they did in terms of idolatry. And that, again, is their distinctive form of religion. They aren't true to the faith of Jerusalem, of the temple. But still, at the end of this process, there are consequences to the king's reign, that his army, and we never know quite if these numbers are quite right, but his army is much smaller. So there's 50 horsemen, a very small cavalry, 10 chariots, 10,000 footmen, which sounds like a lot, but it was less than what it was. Because again, the king of Aram had all this success against them militarily. And so kind of wraps up this reign. And again, you can look at the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel, which we don't have. And then he died. So same thing that's going on then. Joash in Judah, long-serving king, Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, began to reign over Israel and Samaria. So he reigned for 16 years. So roughly the same length of time. Same type of result, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He didn't depart from the sins of his ancestors. And again, it's kind of a footnote, almost a cliff note version of, he did bad. He wasn't a good king like all of his other fellow Israel kings. Let's see. He also fought against Judah, and that was something that would happen on and off. That they would ally against one of the neighboring kings against each other, Judah against Israel, or Israel against Judah. And so, again, that king dies. And now, who's been our hero for the first several chapters of 2 Kings, Elisha, the disciple of Elijah, is fallen sick. So we haven't heard too much about him in the last few chapters anyway. And so it's interesting that Joash, so this evil king, and the kings of Israel have this long-term bad relationship with the prophets, with Elijah and Elisha in particular. He comes down upset. And it's interesting, he kind of says something that has echoes of what Elisha said to Elijah. So it's kind of strange. If you remember when Elijah is taken up into heaven, it says, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And again, that's kind of thrown out there without much explanation. So we're not sure if Joash is seeing a vision or what, but he's making that statement. So he is acknowledging Elisha is about to transition. And so Elisha gives him this kind of what's called a prophetic sign act. So to do something. And so when we read about the prophets, they often act out something. It's symbolic. And so it's conveying something. So he gives like stage directions to this king, this wicked king, to do something. And that's going to be a symbol of God's message to him. So he says, take a bow and arrow. And he does. And then he says, draw the bow, and Elisha is kind of helping him to do that. And then, open the window and shoot the arrow. So in verse 17, and then this interpretation, the Lord's arrow of victory over Aram. So this is a symbolic act that because this is like letting him know that God is going to bring them victory. Then he does a second symbolic act, or for him to do something, says, take arrows, this quiver, and strike the ground. And so the king does this, strikes it 3 times. And then again, this way, we don't probably fully understand rationally. The man of God, Elisha, is upset with him and said, you should have struck the ground more often. So, they had a little bit of a dysfunctional relationship because I would have said, well, you didn't tell me. But anyway, he should have struck the ground more often as a way of saying, this is a symbol of the victory that we're going to have. And if he had struck the ground more often, there would have been a more complete victory of Israel over Aram. But now it'll be a more modest victory because he only struck the ground 3 times. And then it concludes the Elisha cycle of stories that he died. He's buried. And then this is another odd story. If you had read it that ahead, you probably would have had some questions. That they bury Elisha. And then I'll just read it. Now, bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year. As a man was being buried, a marauding band was seen, and the man was, I guess, hurriedly thrown into the grave of Elisha. And as soon as the man touched the bones of Elisha, he came to life and stood on his feet. So if anyone is from a Catholic tradition, or you just read about it, that's kind of I'm not sure how it's used by the church, but that whole sense of what relics are good for, they're powerful, that relics are something that if they're in your church or you pray with or around relics, that they have kind of this residual power. That's the idea of the saints, that to be certified as a saint in the Catholic tradition, you have to have miracles in your life or even in your death, that your body has this residual grace or power. And so, to my knowledge, that's the first example of it in the Bible, and maybe, if not the only, I can't think of any others. But that Elisha was such a holy person, even his skeletal remains, it says the bones were all that were left, were able to do this. So again, we covered a pretty good chunk of stuff, but any questions about any of that or comments? Yeah, Scott.
Just the striking with the arrows reminded me of Moses in the desert,
right,
where he strikes the rock. And if I remember correctly, that's what disqualified him from going into the promised land, is because he struck it more than once.
Right.
So I guess if you're here striking with the arrows, I mean, he's probably thinking, what am I supposed to do? Is once enough? And Elisha's telling him, no, you should have done it 5 or 6 times.
That's why I called it dysfunctional. If you have any of those families where you don't know the rules, so you break them, but whatever the reason, it may be reading back into the story why Israel was not more successful against Aram. So it gives you an explanation of it based on this enacted word that he didn't do enough striking. But yeah, maybe he had the Moses story in his head, said, well, I'll try 3. Other thoughts or questions?
I have another answer to that.
You have another answer. Great.
I think that it means to me in my own life, and hopefully taking it out of the history and having some meaning for us as we read this thing about 3 times or 12 times or whatever, is that when you hear the voice of God and you're inspired, don't do the next thing half-heartedly.
Okay.
I think he was condemned for lack of energy. Like,
okay.
Elisha says, strike the ground. And he goes, boom, 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 and stopped.
Right.
And he just stopped. Like, okay, that's enough.
Okay.
Well, was it enough in the mind of God what he was to do?
Yeah. No, that's a fair question.
A little more energy, less half-heartedness about doing the will.
Okay. Can y'all hear what we're saying in the room? What Louise said?
Some of it, I was a little confused.
Not well.
The basic message, if I can summarize, and you tell me, is that one insight she had from the story about striking the ground is whenever God calls you to do something, don't do it half-heartedly. Do it with all your might, all your energy. And so in that case, 3 was not energetic enough. So doing it as many times as you can, 5 or 6 times, would have been a better, more faithful response. So that's doing a little rabbinical work. So, that's what rabbis do. And I guess I qualify as one where you take it and you try and, get a meaning out of it that isn't obvious in the text, but it's, interpreting the text. So that's a good thing to do. Other thoughts or questions?
Well, that's what I saw as being in conflict, because if you take that back to Moses, then he'd still be striking the rock.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so he was penalized for striking him more than once.
I think, and we'd have to go and look at the text, I think it just said, and again, I'm not a lawyer for God or for Moses, but I think it said strike the rock, and the idea was once. But for us and for our lives, how we live our faith, I think both of those stories have something to teach us. I think it's good to be faithful, to listen to what God is saying and do it to the best of your ability, whether that's hitting it once or many times. And know you'll get it wrong, it seems, at least part of the time. All right, let's keep reading. So Elisha died. That's in verse 20 of chapter 13. And so there's this back and forth. Again, let me look at the maps. I know that's a good thing to do. All right. So you can see Aram, which we looked at before, is up here, if you can see the cursor. And again, that's Damascus is, that same city that is in the news today. So up what we now call Syria. But Aram was the king there. And then we'll talk some about Ammon, and that's Jordan, basically. Again, some continuity if you know that geography and the cities. And then this, of course, is Samaria and Israel, the northern kingdoms. So they're going to be fighting with, different other kingdoms, and then at times with Judah. So Judah is down here to the south. Philistia, where the Philistines are here, what we know as Gaza today. Edom is south of Judah. Moab. So these are all, rival kingdoms that go back hundreds of years with each other. So they've been fighting. And at one point, as a united kingdom, Israel was dominant, and many of them were subordinate vassal states. And at other times, especially after the division, it kind of goes back and forth. So with that set up, so Israel in the back and forth with Aram takes over parts of, let's see, I think it went down. Takes over parts of, Hazael of Aram oppressed Israel, but the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion. And again, they attribute these victories one way or the other to God's intervention. And that it's interesting, even though Israel has done all this wrong, has idolatrous religious practice, isn't being loyal to the house of David, it says in verse 23, because of God's covenant with the patriarchs, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he continued this kind of protection of Israel, though there would be this cycle of, they do wrong, they're defeated or oppressed, and then God restores them. And so that continues to be, the covenant continues despite their sin. King Hazael, verse 24, dies. Ben-Hadad, who, again, we've heard these figures, succeeded him. Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, took, again, from Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael, the town. So again, it's this back and forth kind of border conflict. Who controls certain parts of the border territory, kind of like Alsace-Lorraine with France and Germany. So chapter 14, in the second year of King Joash, son of Joahaz, of Israel, King Amaziah, son of Joash of Judah, began to reign. So Amaziah is this very, pivotal king, I think it's fair to say. He was 25, so a little bit older than some of his other successors or ancestors had been. And he reigns for 29 years, so a pretty long time. Talks about his mama, who was from Jerusalem. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, yet not all the way right. So again, this common refrain with the kings in Judah. And the recurrent thing is, again, the high places. You hear them talk about that. And that's any type of worship outside of the temple, not necessarily idolatrous. It could be some type of synchronistic where it's Yahweh, but also maybe a local god or spirit. Probably something around agriculture, around fruitfulness. So that was very popular with the people. So that was kind of a bridge too far for most of these kings. So verse 5, again, this is the Godfather stuff or the Soprano stuff, that his father had been murdered, and there are servants in the royal household who were responsible, and so he killed them. So, he kind of cleaned up that. I don't know if cleaned up is the right word, but he avenged what had been done. But this is an interesting, he had been to Sunday school, so he had some moral limits. And so in the law of Moses, it says that, let's see, the parents shall not be put to death for the children, or the children put to death for the parents, but all shall be put to death for their own sins. So the idea there is that, especially in a political sense, in a dynastic sense, there's a temptation you wipe out the rival and all their family. But what he did instead was just kill the people who were responsible for, the death of his father. So the children were allowed to live. And then it goes on with what Amaziah did. He killed a bunch of Edomites. So again, Edom, one of those border kingdoms. It talks about his victories and what he was able to keep. And then this story, I'll try and paraphrase. So there are these two kings of Israel and Judah. Amaziah is kind of feeling his oats, I guess you could say. He has this pretty big victory over Edom. And so he sends messengers to King Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, so the Israelite king. Come, let us look one another in the face. So that means that more or less the two kings kind of do a meeting to kind of discuss, is there a way without conflict to have some type of change in their relationship? Because Judah, again, was more the subordinate kingdom in those two kingdoms' relationship. So, it kind of wants to meet as equals to work out how they're going to be in relationship. And so this is kind of an interesting response. It seems like he's quoting a parable. King Jehoash of Israel sent word to King Amaziah of Judah, a thorn bush on Lebanon sent to a cedar on Lebanon, saying, give your daughter to my son for a wife. But a wild animal of Lebanon passed by and trampled down the thorn bush. So he goes on to kind of interpret the parable. Because you've defeated Edom, your heart has lifted you up. Be content with your glory. This is the king of Israel's message to the king of Judah. Stay at home. Don't mess with me. Why should you provoke trouble? So again, he obviously is diminishing Judah. Says, you're like a thorn bush and I'm like a big cedar tree. If you come take me on, something bad's going to happen. But as happens, Amaziah would not listen. So the king of Israel went up, and he and Amaziah, they faced one another, not in a diplomatic encounter, but in battle. And Judah was defeated. So what the king of Israel had predicted came true, and they fled home. King Jehoash of Israel captured Amaziah, and he came to Jerusalem. And this is the first time, I believe, where Jerusalem is defeated and conquered. That happens with the Babylonians a couple hundred years from now. But he broke down the wall. Jerusalem was a walled city in a very fortified position on a mountain, near a mountain and around a mountain. And so he breaks down part of the wall and he seizes all the gold and silver from the temple. And then he takes hostages and returns to Samaria. So, it's a total defeat. The treasury at the temple is really emptied many times to either pay tribute so they don't have a fight or when they're defeated. So I think they had a lot of treasure. But then it does the summary statement in verse 15. The rest of the acts that Jehoash did, his might and how he fought, they're recorded. So he slept with his ancestors. And then Amaziah is kind of an interesting conclusion to his life. That he, after he's defeated, he's not killed. It's not clear if he's still in power. It says that his reign continues, but what happens to him is he leaves at some point. There's a conspiracy against him, and he flees to this other area, Lachish. And so there, people went after him and actually kill him. So they brought him back then to Jerusalem, and they did bury him. So Amaziah is no longer king. Azariah becomes king. He's 16, so obviously a young person. And he does different public works. So again, that's a lot of material. I know I'm going fast, but let's stop for a minute and see what questions or insights you have from all that war stuff. Feel sometimes like a high school or history teacher where you're just doing battles, dates. But again, remember where is God in this? To keep asking ourselves that. What is God doing in the midst of all this human mischief? Yeah. So, any thoughts or questions?
Right. Over what period of time does this section?
That's a good question. I think it's around 50 years, more or less.
All this fighting in 50 years.
Yeah, I don't have it written in my notes exactly, but I think that's about right.
I have the years in here, but where would you start this whole?
Yeah, well, Jehoahaz is kind of the beginning in chapter 13, okay. And then how that runs through to the person who just died, Amaziah of Judah. So you got two.
From 814 to 798, and where do you want to go to now to where we are?
If you can get the Judah side with Amaziah.
Amaziah, 781.
Yeah.
The ends of their reigns.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not very long.
It's about 50 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is a poor population. I mean, they were constantly under battle or in siege or whatever.
Yeah, if you can't hear that, the period of time is roughly 50 years, and someone commented about the poor population, which is often the case. The civilian casualties we think of as a more modern phenomena, but there's things like famine because of the sieges when that happens, and just having the young men called up, be drafted into these armies that fight each other. Generally, in this period of time, warfare is not like in a modern sense, probably. It's more like raiding parties, and you try and take over territory, a border town, or you try and get some type of tribute from the other side. So it's almost like a strategy, if you control it, to try and, you're not trying to wipe the other people out, you're trying to get advantage. So that's kind of what was going on. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Louise.
I just want to go back real quick to 14:3.
Okay.
3 to 4, which is basically where it says that, which one? Mother's name. So who is that now? It's Joahaz, king of Israel, Joash. Okay, so he reigned, he did what is pleasing to Yahweh, though not like his ancestor David. Now, since we, a few months ago, were with all the shenanigans that David got involved with, Bathsheba,
right,
and the Absalom, and the evil god Nathan, the prophet, and all this bad stuff happening. I'm wondering why excuse the expression, whitewash of this through. It's going to keep going, I know, because, David is the king from which Jesus comes. So, but the point is, do they have to put all this in there when the folks who were reading it, and even the editors, I'm sure the writers, knew full well they were kind of, sanctifying David to show what other people did wrong. But if you go back and look at what David did, he had a lot of good points, but he did a lot of nasty stuff.
Right.
And he and his sons and the sons after him paid for it dearly. So that was just a comment.
Sure.
What do people think about that? Why is that?
Yeah. So if you didn't hear what Louise was saying, basically in verse 3 of chapter 14, it talks about David as kind of this model, that if you want to compare how well kings do, are they as good as David? A couple of things. She points out, of course, that David was, faithful and good in many ways, but he had his issues, right? So Bathsheba alone, would disqualify him, you would think, from any type of example. Killing her husband, the whole act was not very good. So the sequence of things, but I guess what David has held up as an example is his religious faithfulness, not always his moral purity, and that he didn't do idolatrous acts. So these other kings would do other, types of worship against what David did more faithfully. So I think that's at least part of it. Part of it is a whitewash, I guess, or, like in our own history, what do we remember? How do we amplify certain parts and kind of keep quiet other parts? All nations tend to do that. And David is like a George Washington, would be the closest analogy in our national history. So you want to remember all the great things, and, which there are many great things. But, that then would be, is he a president? We could say today, like George Washington, or more often, I think we use Abraham Lincoln. And, we want to say, how do they measure up? So I think David is at the measuring up type for the kings of Judah, and that seems to be the main answer. Any comments on that or other questions or insights? They needed a hero, someone said.
That makes sense, what you said.
Yeah, I think, it's, or even family histories. I don't want to get too close to nerves. We tend to remember good things. And rightfully so. In a eulogy, you don't hear the bad stuff, right? Or not often. So, it's how we think of people who are important to us. And, it's somewhat human, somewhat, in this case, probably philosophical, theological. All right, let's go up to verse 23. Jeroboam II. So remember, Jeroboam is the founding king of the northern kingdom, the rebel against Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon. So in the 15th year of King Amaziah, King Jeroboam, so it's a little confusing, so it's the second, begins to reign, and he reigns for 41 years. So he reigns for a long time. And again, that quick synopsis in verse 24, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He didn't depart from any of the sins of Jeroboam. So again, that was a founding sin, to idolatry at other temples besides Jerusalem, and remember the golden calves. So that's kind of the sin of Jeroboam. Whenever they use that, it's a rival worship. And he restored the border. He did different military conquests to make the border of the northern kingdom, according to this, almost as big as it was during the time of Solomon. So there's a certain glory in his reign. And it says in verse 25, the second half of this was according to the word of the prophet Jonah. Now it's identified with Jonah, son of Amittai, who was, that little 4-chapter book in the Old Testament. Supposedly it's the same prophet. That story seems more of a parable, but it's still important to know there's some type of historical connection there, or narrative connection. And so, let's see. So the Lord was kind of responding to Israel's distress, even though, with all their sin. So he continues, though, to intervene on Israel's behalf, in spite of these issues that are due to its being unfaithful. Jeroboam doesn't get a lot of press, though. After that, it kind of moves on and says, you can read more in that famous book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel. So again, in a quick summary, didn't change, same religious issues. But in spite of the religious issues, God blesses and protects them and kind of restores some of the glory of the former kingdom. So in this long reign of King Jeroboam, there's a new king in Judah, Azariah. He was 16 when he began to reign. He reigns 52 years. So again, a long time. Talks about his mama. So we're getting mothers from Jerusalem. So instead of these mothers from other kingdoms, it would seem to imply if she's from Jerusalem, she is probably part of that, religious and political structure. So she is probably more faithful to the religion of the temple. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, like Amaziah. But again, the high places were not taken away. It doesn't happen, I think, to Hezekiah that the high places are addressed. And again, I don't know if the people were ever in favor of that. So it's an interesting thing. And so because that continued, the high places continued to be a religious practice, the Lord struck the king. So why he was struck with leprosy, it says, and not some of the other kings who didn't take the high places away, not real clear. But again, in footnotes in the Bible, what we know as leprosy may not have been what he had. It may have been some other type of skin disease, but it was something that was noticeable externally, and that in the law of Moses would have caused you to need to be quarantined, we would say in more modern term, or separated. And so it says in verse 5, he lived in a separate house. Jotham, the king's son, was in charge of the palace. So he had kind of a regent, kind of instead of usually as a parent for a minor, this was a child or son of the king who was in charge of the palace. So doing a lot of the day-to-day functioning of the kingdom. Now the rest of the acts of Azariah and all that he did, again, are written, and he slept with his ancestors. And so Jotham, who's been running things, succeeds him. So that makes sense. So in the 38th year of King Azariah, so this long-serving Judean king, Zechariah, son of Jeroboam, reigned over Israel, but just for 6 months. Did what was evil. So again, the pattern repeats. Keeps doing those same sins of Jeroboam. And so there's a conspiracy. So again, this is a repeated thing, an assassination in public by a person named Shalom. And he takes his place. And again, very short reign. And so let's see. And so the theological connection of verse 12, this was the end of the dynasty of Jehu, that his sons, even though he was very important in this revenge against Ahab and Jezebel, that there'd be a limit to Jehu's reign. And so there it was. So Shallum, this person who took over, who killed the reigning king, reigns, but only for 1 month. So again, from a Israelite perspective, it's very unstable. So, like what we were saying earlier, there's a lot of war, and then there's a lot of kings in a short period of time. And I think, be sure I say it right. Yeah, there's just 5 of 6 kings in this period are assassinated. So, again, what you read about in histories in a lot of, countries where there's political instability, whether the military intervenes or they're just one leader after another. So Shallum doesn't have a very long reign, and Menachem then takes over. Let's see. Yeah, Menachem kills Shallum, takes over, and again, talks about some of his military exploits. We won't get into some of what we would consider war crimes, but, kind of a nasty guy. Verse 17, 39th year of King Azariah of Judah, Menachem begins to reign. He reigns for 10 years. So there's more stability instead of a month or a year. But again, did what was evil. And so Assyria is always this big shadow that is over both Israel and Judah and all the surrounding kingdoms. It was really, other than Egypt, which was this great empire, Assyria was the first great Mesopotamian empire. And so they at different times would go into, this Near East area around what we consider Israel and all the surrounding kingdoms, and would come in and take over some or just defeat them and get tribute. And so Menachem knows, you're not going to win against Assyria. And so he gives the king, Pul, 1,000 talents of silver, and to kind of not only buy him off, but also to say, will you support me in my reign? And then he had a very high tax on all the wealthy people. So like 50 shekels of silver from each one, and then translated into 1,000 talents. Let's see. Now, again, the rest of the deeds of Menachem, kind of summarizes that, again, his reign ends. Let's see if we can finish at least chapter 15. We may not get all the way through. But then again, there's a combination of different rulers. Pekahiah is, again, during the reign of King Azariah in Judah. Pekahiah succeeds after Menachem. He reigns just for 2 years. So again, a month, a year, 10 years, back to 2 years, he did what was evil. And so he was assassinated. So another king is killed by Pekah, son of Remaliah, his captain. So one of his close military guard conspired against him with 50 other Gileadites, and attacked him in Samaria. And so that is another disruption to stability. And then Pekah reigns. He reigns 20 years. So again, longer reign, did what was evil. And again, Assyria comes. So Assyria, you're building up their interventions where chapter 17 will be the ultimate defeat of the northern kingdom. And so the king of Assyria takes over parts of Samaria or Israel, including Galilee, which we all know from the New Testament. So kind of the northern border of Israel. Let's see. Then Hoshea, so like Hosea, son of Elah, made a conspiracy against Pekah. So again, all this intrigue, and attacked him and killed him, and he reigned in his place. So there's, again, instability. And let's say, I think we can finish that. So in the second year, in verse 32 of chapter 15, in the second year of King Pekah, son of Remaliah of Israel, King Jotham, son of Uzziah of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he begins his reign. He reigns for 16 years. Talks about his mama. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, just as his father Uzziah had done. And again, high places not removed. People still sacrificing. He did some public works projects like the Upper Gate. The archaeologists say they're not sure what this area would have been. It's not real clear from the text. But again, it gives you that summary. let's see. Trying to think any other significant things. So we'll stop at chapter 15 because I don't think we can get through 16 effectively. We covered a lot of that in my notes. Let's stop here. What thoughts, questions, ideas? Are you glad you lived today, or do you wish you lived in the 9th century in Israel? Today? Seems to be a consensus for today. I think that's right. Oh, okay. Hutch, is your hand up? Sorry.
It's interesting. The Northern Kingdom is in a state of decline. It's approaching the end. It'll be wiped off the face of the earth in 721. But what's interesting to me is there's kind of a parallel in the decline of the Roman Empire, especially 2nd through 3rd centuries AD. Again, just like in the north here, the reign of the emperors in Rome at that time were very brief, very bloody. It was just one emperor after another in a short reign. We see a parallel thing happening in the Northern Kingdom as the train is approaching its wreck, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and that's, again, you really, when you study the Bible, the glory period, however you define it, is really short with Israel, which is the United Kingdom. You could count part of the time under King Saul and, of course, David and Solomon. And really, all of those reigns together is maybe 100 years. And then after that, it's just one thing after another. And then 2 huge defeats, a lot of smaller defeats, but one leading to the exile of the Northern Kingdom, and they never return. And then the exile, the Babylonian exile, and those people do return. And then there's continuity that leads again to the time of Jesus. But it's very short period of glory and a long period of troubles. What other thoughts or questions?
I sometimes wonder
what
the landscape of this country was, because with people fighting all the time, I don't know how they could grow crops or dig a well or do whatever. Because there was so many invasions and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
It seems constant. The years that we're covering, it was constant.
Right. Now, that's a good, if you couldn't hear, with warfare, how do you have, crops and, trade and stability? And there's some of each, there are military folks on the call, they can answer it better probably, but basically, if you're an army and you're wanting to keep the food as best you can to feed your army if you're defeating it. So you probably aren't going to wipe out the crops, but that can be a strategy either as part of the siege. So no one has food, especially if you have a good supply line and you can take care of your own soldiers. But at the same time, that's, not their objective. But then there's also times where you've defeated your enemy and you want to crush them. And when you do that, you wipe out the fruit trees, olive trees, all the crops. And what that does is, make them very weak. And so that, I think, I'm not an expert, but I think that would be the exception. And that's usually when you want to be sure they don't come back, that you're really destroying them. So, but that's a good question. What other thoughts, or anyone have a better insight about that? Okay. Well, next week we'll start with chapter 16, verse 1, and we'll get through 17 for sure. And I may give us some summary stuff, but 17, if you have time, read 17, because that's the fall of Israel. So that's actually a very big, pivotal story in the history of our faith, the Jewish people, and how that influences even us in different ways today. All right, we'll go in peace to love and serve